So here we are, right? Something like 18, 19 years after the signing of the Agile Manifesto. Why are we still talking about transformation? Like, why is it so hard? One of the things that I think is an interesting challenge in our industry is that we have this kind of hypothesis, this underlying way of thinking that basically says, if we teach people how to do practices, if we teach people the ways of Scrum or SAFe or large-scale Scrum or what have you, that the agility will come. And what I think we're finding in a lot of contexts is that there's underlying organizational challenges that get in the way of us being able to exploit these practices to our advantage. And so, the first thing that I kind of want to offer to you today as you think about this is that there's a difference between Agile as like a methodology and agility, right? We know what Agile is, right? It's daily stand-up meetings, it's reviews, it's retrospectives, it's sprint planning, user stories, burn down charts, velocity, right? All that stuff. That's Agile. Agility is about the ability to respond to emerging understanding of our markets, emerging understanding of our customer needs. And we'd like to believe that by doing Agile stuff, that we're going to achieve agility. But I think a lot of times in practice, we're finding that it doesn't necessarily work that way. And so one of the things that we've been exploring for, the last 8 years in various forms or fashion is really what we're starting to talk about is this notional idea of a system of delivery versus a system of transformation. The idea that how we operate is different than how we become the kind of company that can operate that way. Does that kind of make sense at all? Right? So system of delivery, the way that we work, versus system of transformation, the way that we get there. I was thinking about if I could figure out an analogy that would hold. And when I turned 40 8 years ago now, I decided I wanted to become a runner. What I actually was an overweight couch potato at the time. Okay? Literally, when I first started running, I couldn't run more than a quarter of a mile without stopping. Can anybody relate to that? Yeah, okay, cool. Well, so what was interesting is a friend of mine challenged me to go run a marathon. And literally from being overweight, sitting on the couch, not able to run a quarter of a mile, 26.2 miles seemed incredibly daunting. And, there was no amount of running shoes, running shorts, really cool tops, right? You know kind of intuitively how to run. But the question is how do you become a runner? Right? It's interesting. It's like a different thing, right? Everybody knows how to run, but how do you become a runner that's capable of running a marathon, right? It's interesting. And there's a book, and I looked it up this morning because it's been a long time since I read it. And it's something like, I can't even think of the author anymore. I have no short-term memory. And it was basically the non-runner's marathon trainer or something like that. And what was interesting is that it basically laid out a 15-week program that said, this is how you become a marathon runner. It was kind of interesting. There's actually a section on when your toenails start to fall off. It's kind of cool, right? It's kind of nice to know if your toenails are going to fall off. You kind of want to know your toenails are going to fall off. Is that too gross for you guys this morning? Maybe make sure everybody's paying attention. Did Mike really say toenails are going to fall off? Okay, cool. So what this talk is largely about, it's largely about how do you get people to move, right? How do you get people to go? And so, as was mentioned, I'm Mike Cottmeyer. I started my company Leading Agile about 8.5 years ago, and really decided I just wanted to go out and be an independent consultant. And did anybody know that if you want to become an independent consultant, you have to learn how to sell? It's actually kind of interesting. And the ironic thing is, if you don't sell stuff, you don't eat. Right? And so I went out and I started saying, okay, well, I got to find work, right? And how do I do this? And next thing you know, we have about 110 people working with us. We're working with a lot of the Fortune 100 people. We've been in business for, like I said, almost 9 years now. And when you first start, you have these ideas of how to do this stuff. And you have like hypotheses, right? But nobody's hiring you to go do that. And we've been fortunate over the last 9 years to really start to get traction, right? To really be able to go into some of these large companies. And a lot of what shapes how I think about this stuff is, candidly, when you're a sales guy and you're trying to get people to hire you, you actually have to prove to people that what you do has value, right? I mean, how many people here have a blank check to do whatever they want within their organizations without having to prove it works? Anybody? Oh, a few people. Okay, cool. Great for you, right? But the rest of us, whether we're consultants or contractors or permanent employees, like, we have to kind of justify our existence. And so a lot of the language and the thinking tools that we're going to explore here is really about justifying our existence. And so, like I said, there's a difference between being able to point at the top of the mountain and say, this is where we need to go, versus being able to take somebody arm in arm and say, this is how you get there. Right? This is what it looks like to become a marathon runner. This is the step at which your toenails are going to fall off. These are the tools that you need to be able to do this, right? So we have to create momentum, but we also have to sustain momentum, okay? So what we started to do is we started to think through what would a framework for change begin to look like. And as you might imagine, there's 1,000 different ways to do any of this stuff. And so what I'm going to talk with you guys about over the next 50 minutes or so are the things that I think are important for you to consider. I might even go so far as to say, if you don't consider these things, you are remiss, right? You are leaving something significant out. Now, how I think about these things, the specific data that I'm going to give you, my specific point of view, is less important. I think it's pretty strong, right? But it's less important than, hey, you need to consider this. And so how the talk is organized, as you might imagine, is 4 columns, right? It's the, why are we doing this? Anybody think it's like a good idea to have like a pretty strong why? Right? If you're going to spend millions of dollars and upheave your entire organization, you kind of might want to know why. The next section is what? What are we actually going to go change? Like, what are we going to go do? Okay? It's not necessarily clear. Train people is not the right answer. Okay? There are levers within your organization that you're going to have to pull. There are outcomes that you are going to want to achieve, and we need to get really clear on what levers we're going to pull and what outcomes we're going to achieve. The next column is the how column. Okay, so you get approval, you get buy-in, you've economically justified it. Now you have to go do something. What are you going to go do? Train people how to be Scrum Masters is not the right answer. Okay? And then who do we need to enlist to do it? Okay? So that's kind of the framework. So let's break this down a little bit more. So the business case, we're going to talk about what are the most common economic drivers that basically justify an agile transformation. Okay? Because we want to get really clear on what is the business problem that your organization wants to solve. And again, I'll tip my hat. It's not adopt Scrum. It's never adopt Scrum. There's always something bigger that we're trying to achieve. The next thing is, what is our transformation hypothesis? Now, I struggle sometimes when you're architecting a talk to say, well, why is the transformation hypothesis in the why column? Well, because it really lined up into grids, and it was like a really cool 2x2, kind of a thing, 2x8. No, but the reason is that we're going to make some decisions about how to orchestrate this hypothesis or this transformation, and we want to understand why we're making those decisions. So why are we doing the transformation at all, and then why are we approaching it the way that we're approaching it? Okay? because every organization is different in terms of the impediments that it's going to need to overcome. The next thing is theory and approach. If anybody's heard me talk before, you might have heard me talk about the 3 things or the 4 quadrants or the 10 circles, things like that. There is, I believe, an underlying physics of how you get an organization to point A to B. Okay? And the thing is, it's interesting, is that a lot of times where we want it to be in the future, there are intermediate steps necessary to get there. I wanted to be a marathon runner, but the first step of the book was actually just figure out how to go run 3 miles. Right? Didn't tell you how to go run 3 miles, but that was like a really quick, immediate goal. And then it started to take you week by week by week by week into how to be a marathon runner. Okay? So there's a physics to how things change. The next piece that we're going to talk about is this idea of reference architecture. And I don't do it explicitly in this talk, but we'll talk around it a lot, is the idea of reference architecture versus reference implementation. How many people in the room consider themselves like a student of Agile methodologies? Like we could sit down and have a conversation about SAFe versus LESS versus disciplined Agile delivery versus Scrum versus XP. Cool. What you'll find is that up underneath all of those are really common patterns. They're not all that different at the end of the day. So the patterns that unify us across methodology, I call reference architecture. SAFe as a methodology is a specific implementation of those common patterns. Large-scale Scrum is an implementation of those common patterns. What's interesting is when you separate reference architecture from reference implementation, it unlocks the world for you. Because if you understand deeply the patterns of agility, the reference architecture of agility, then when you say, like, how many people are like implementing SAFe, but they've customized it for their own organization, right? When you understand the reference architecture that's underneath SAFe, you can make choices about how to implement it that are unique to your organization while preserving the patterns that make it successful. Okay? And so a lot of times what we see in SAFe implementations are people picking and choosing practices, but fundamentally violating the reference architecturally significant patterns. And what we want to do is we want to be able to tailor the methodology to our unique instance without breaking why it actually works. And then it's going to get kind of interesting, right? So how do we change, right? So we understand why we're doing it and why we're approaching it the way we are. We start to learn the physics of how organizations move. We start to understand the base patterns that we're moving towards. Now we have to explore how are we going to get there from a change management perspective. Okay? What are we going to do to systematically begin introducing change? Next thing, how are we going to measure results? How do we know that this effort that we're putting into the transformation is actually making the progress that we expect and generating the business outcomes that we desire? It's fascinating, right? Cool. So last, into who. Now this is going to get a little specific to us and how we're thinking about this, and I'm going to attempt to generalize it. And so we'll talk a little bit about different roles and responsibilities, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to get up underneath those roles and responsibilities and really focus on roles that create influence and roles that build trust. Okay? And last but not least, I'm going to try super hard not to cut myself short on this. It's probably already impossible because I've probably spent way too much time in the preamble here. But the skills and experiences necessary. We've grown really rapidly. Like I said, about 110 people. We've probably hired 40 in the last 6 or 8 months. Cracking the code of what makes somebody good at being a change agent is fascinating. There's a science behind it, right? It's really interesting. Okay, cool. So let's do a quick time check. Okay, so I'm already late, so it's all good. Okay, so you guys have little cards on your thing. One of the challenges I had, I first pulled this deck together for Agile 2018 last year, and This is the culmination of, almost my life's work, right? So I've been noodling around on this for about 10 or 12 years now. And so what we realize is that, you either pick one piece and go deep or you go super broad. And so we've decided to go super broad in this kind of a presentation, especially like in a keynote. And so there's like, if you want the deck, if you want the white paper that comes, if you contact us, we can give you videos of this presentation. We're actually live streaming this talk now, if you want to go back and look at it. And so there's a lot of resources that are up underneath this if you guys want access to those. So business case. So we've agreed, at least I hope we've agreed in principle, that the #1 business driver of adopting Scrum is not to have Scrum Masters. It's not to do daily stand-up meetings. It's not to do reviews and retrospectives. Those things are only beneficial to us to the extent that they drive business agility. But we have to even get up underneath that, and we have to go, what is business agility? One of the things that was really fascinating, a little fun fact about my history, is that I worked for version 1 for a couple years. And that was like my first real Agile job. I guess they're collabing now, right? But it was my first real Agile job. And I was running around training, coaching, I was trying on ideas, I was trying on language. And as an Agilist, I get really enamored with the idea of responding to change, responding to market, innovation, things like that. Well, what people were telling me is that most of the time, what they were doing was going for predictability. They wanted to be able to make and meet commitments because waterfall or nothing ad hoc was not serving them. Okay? So predictability. So I'll just kind of blow through this a little bit. Quality was the next one, right? We want to stop putting crap in market, right? We want to stop having defective products. We want to stop getting calls in the middle of the night. Agile, and the definition of done at the end of every sprint, promises that to us. We want to get early return on investment. That means that we want to be able to start to put things in market, and we want to be able to start charging money for it. Okay, because that's most of the time why we're doing this stuff. And if it's not money, it's some other sort of value that's important to us. Okay, so we want to be able to put things in front of our customers. We want to be able to start achieving the goals of that product development early. We don't want to wait 3 years for it. Lower costs. It's always an interesting one, right? Because everybody's like, it's like a Dilbert cartoon. It's like, well, we want to do Agile so we can lower costs, right? That kind of a thing. Well, we know that most organizations are 10 times overloaded, have way more to do than what we can do, right? But here's the thing. Whether we can actually lower costs or not, one of the things that we know is that companies want to, okay? And sometimes they're trying to use Agile as a lever to do it. Innovation. Are we able to compete in market? Are we able to put things in market that our customers will buy? Can we disrupt our markets? Product fit. Are we building the right things? Are we building things that satisfy customers' needs? And here's the thing that I want to say, right? Is that depending upon what the goals of your transformation are, it is going to inform the methodology that you choose, and it's going to inform the controls that you put in place to ensure it. Okay? So let's say, for example, I'm a small team lean startup guy, and I'm working on a large, Richmond, Washington, D.C. area, a large defense contractor project, right? The idea of give me a bucket of money and we'll inspect and adapt our way into the best possible solution is probably not language that will resonate. Fair? Okay? So the point being, okay, without going too deep into it, is that the business drivers that are justifying the transformation work are going to shape and inform the decisions that you make about the transformation. Is that fair? An organization that's going for predictability is going to have an implementation of Agile that looks different than from one that is going for high velocity innovation. Okay? And I think Agile is flexible enough to accommodate both. Where we get in traps sometimes is that the business will have one set of goals, but us as Agilists, we have a different set of goals for them. Anybody in that situation? Right? And that's okay. Right? That's okay. But sometimes the game is played by meeting the organization where it is and helping it get to where it needs to be. okay? Sometimes you can't see your way to the kind of organization you need to be that's like highly innovative until you take the noise out of the system and you start making it really predictable first, okay? So that's my first point. Have to understand the business drivers behind the transformation, and we have to make sure that the choices we're making organizationally have like a real tangible line of sight to being able to deliver that goal. Not hypothetical, not I hope it will, not it should someday, but this is the mechanism by which it's going to happen, right? And that's a different bar. Gosh, I really want to see if you guys have any questions, but we have such a short amount of time. Transformation hypothesis. The guy from Harvard, you guys just mentioned this just in your talk a little bit. The idea that transformation is not just about culture. It's not just about processes. The word I put up here is systems. I could have put ecosystems. I could have put lots of different words up there. Structure is a word that I use sometimes. But what my belief is that a transformation is an integration between the organizational structure, the alignment type issues, how we form teams, right, that kind of a thing. It's the structure of the organization, the ecosystem that the organization lives in, enabled by the processes and practices congruent with that structure, and pointed towards the kinds of cultural behaviors that we want to get. A lot of times what we bet on is that if I can get the culture to change, the operational model and the structure will emerge from that new way of thinking. And there's talks when I go deeper into this where I start to explore, this idea that if we could just get people to get it, they would do all the right things. But the reality is that in a lot of these organizations, we get a lot of people on board with an agile way of thinking, but then they try to apply that agile way of thinking to a 50-year-old legacy mainframe, tightly coupled, architectural model with no continuous integration, no deployment, no encapsulation, no nothing, right? What does that even mean to have an agile mindset if everything in my technology stack gets in the way of me being agile, right? I mean, maybe it'll help some, but it's not going to be game changing, okay? So kind of the general hypothesis here is that if I can form a team, give that team autonomy over their technology stack, dedicate the people to it, reduce the dependencies between that team, right? That is a structural element that I can begin to work with, okay? The processes that enable that team could be Scrum, could be Kanban, could be SAFe, could be lots of things. But if I have this dedicated team and I have dedicated technology stack, I've reduced dependencies, I can start to evolve the culture over time, that becomes a great little pocket of agility within the organization. Okay? But here's the interesting thing is transformational change agents. You guys have to make a bet as to how you're going to proceed. Now, one of the things that I do, it's a thought exercise that I like to run with small groups, and I'll say something to the effect of, if you were king for a day, right, you could do anything you wanted to do. You could flip your fingers and get anybody to think differently. You could get anybody to do anything differently. You could flip whatever you wanted in the organization. You had all the money, you had all the time, you had all the organizational support. Nobody was in your way. Only caveat is in about 3 months you had to start delivering something of value in a measurable way. What would you go do? Right? Your job's on the line. What would you go do? What is your hypothesis for how you're going to lead the transformation? Most of us are so stuck in the mindset of, man, if I could just get this leader to think differently, if I could just get people to agree to do what I want them to do, if I could just, right? And so what I challenge you to think about is that whatever your hypothesis is for how you're going to lead change? What's your line of sight for how it's going to achieve business goals? If you believe that culture is the problem, okay, cool, right? And you're going to start with culture. Ask yourself, once the culture flips, how is that going to make me more predictable? Is it? Right? Chances are there's 10 other things that have to happen once the culture flips to actually get it predictable, but culture felt like it was the barrier. If you're going to start with practices by teaching people Scrum or SAFe or what have you, what's your hypothesis? What's the line of sight to how that is going to drive better quality in your organization? How is it going to drive innovation? How is it going to drive product fit? Do you have the right ecosystem to enable that? And so my general bent is that those three things can be addressed somewhat simultaneously. We have to get the structure right, systems right. We have to install the enabling processes. We have to work with the organization to encourage the culture that we need over time. Okay? So all three things are super important. Other things that cause us to change or put more prescription around the way that we're going to do a transformation is the size of an organization. If you're in a small startup and you've got a team or two, 90% of what I'm talking about today doesn't apply. Okay? But if you are a large, complex organization with multiple divisions, core services, mainframes, web, mobile, lots of different external customers, competing demands, you're overloaded, too much work to do, right? All that kind of stuff. The size and complexity of your organization is material to how you design your agile transformation. The next one, this is killer, and a lot of times people try to take pictures of this. It's not the most readable slide, but the point of this slide is dependencies kill agility. Okay, and one of the funny stories I like to tell, and my wife actually gave me permission at this one point in time, but it's like I tell this little story about like if I'm home by myself and I want to go grab pizza and a beer, go grab pizza and a beer. If I want to go get wings, if I want to go to eat healthy, right, I go do whatever I want. If I'm going to dinner with my wife, right, and we have plans, there's at least one point of negotiation if I want to change my mind, right? Fair? If I'm going with a group of people and we want to change plans, there might be 6 or 7 different points of negotiation. Okay? And then the joke that gets me in trouble, but I have permission for it now, is if I go to dinner with my in-laws who are like almost 80 years old, it's like once you make plans, you can't change them. Right? They're going to get a steak and a potato at 4:30 in the afternoon, and that is the only option that's available to us, right? And so the idea being is that dependencies reduce our degrees of freedom. Okay? They do. And so what we see in agile transformations a lot is that the dependencies seem unbreakable. So we just plow through, we break the methodology, or we don't get the benefits from the methodology that we want. And so you have 2 choices with dependencies. You have to figure out how to manage them, which is going to reduce agility, or you have to figure out how to break them. And they're not going to get broken overnight. Okay? So just know that in the presence of dependencies, something else is required. And then the last little bit in this thing is how much resistance are you going to face? And resistance is an interesting thing nowadays, right? So most organizations we go into, you don't get active in-your-face resistance. Because 9 times out of 10, somebody in the C-suite has decided to spend money on this and wants to go. Right? There's not an executive in the world anymore that hasn't heard of Agile and doesn't want business agility. Like, yeah, I mean, seriously, like CEO, do you want business agility? Of course I want business agility, right? There's like, and so you walk in and everybody says things like, oh yeah, we don't have to convince anybody. Everybody wants to go Agile now. Totally have CEO support, we have funding, we have whatever. But what about that middle manager that spent 25 years of their career doing things exactly the way they've been doing? They have kids in college, maybe a stay-at-home spouse, and you're walking in and disrupting every single thing about their world. Okay? Everything. Right? Their entire power base, their economic structure, their family life, their sense of self, their level of confidence, right? Everything. And we walk in and we're like, we have a better way, right? And it just doesn't work that way, right? People get scared. And so they can't say anymore that they're not on board, but they do things that make it hard, right? And so part of what we have to consider is, how do we bring those people along? How do we create safety? Okay? And so again, transformation hypothesis. Are you going to start with culture? Okay, cool. How are you going to get there? You're going to start with practices? How are you going to get there? You're going to start with all three, or with systems first? How is it going to get you there? Right? What's the size of the organization? How much dependencies? How much resistance do you anticipate? All of that stuff is going to dictate your transformation strategy. Third part, theory and approach. Okay, so lots of stuff in this particular section. So we're going to gloss over the highest level of it. One of the first talks I did around this was at the Scrum gathering in Vegas 6 or 7 years ago. Daniel Gullo invited me to come to a talk, and I put together this talk. I called it the 3 things. And the 3 things for us are teams, backlogs, working tested software. And it's an interesting litmus test when you walk into an organization. I assert that nothing in Agile will work at the team level or at scale unless you have created a complete cross-functional team that has everyone and everything necessary to be able to deliver a working tested increment of that product. That team has to be operating off of a clearly articulated backlog, right? Such that 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 of the things in the backlog can be delivered within a 2-week sprint. That team has to be able to get to a measurable definition of done at the end of the sprint. And as a thought exercise, maybe as a homework exercise or something to contemplate throughout your conference experience today, is what in Scrum could possibly work outside of those 3 conditions? If you don't have a complete cross-functional team or a team that's overburdened with dependencies, that team will never establish a stable velocity. They will never be able to make and meet a commitment. Okay? If they're not operating off of a clearly articulated, maybe even sized backlog, you have no idea when you're going to be done, or even what your rate of progress is. If you can't get to something that's like a working tested increment, or something close enough that we can call it done by the end of the sprint, then you are building technical debt, and you're creating a hidden backlog on the backside, an indeterminate pile of work that we don't even see anymore. Okay? So there's no amount of daily stand-up meeting, there's no amount of review, retrospective, sprint planning, burn down charts, whatever, I believe, that will work in the absence of those 3 things. One of my earliest experiences with this is, would I rather have a product owner, or would I rather have a backlog? Well, you'd like to think like, well, if I have a product owner, the product owner will create the backlog, right? Anybody have any product owners that like can't really create a backlog? Yeah, come on, like everybody raise your hand, seriously. All over the place, right? And I'm not giving product owners a hard time, right? That product owner job as described by Scrum is incredibly difficult, right? And depending upon the scale of the organization, maybe even impossible, okay? But putting somebody in that seat does not necessarily mean that I have a good backlog. So I might rather, and Mike Vizis is probably going to come like tackle me for saying this, but it's like I might rather have a committee of people that can work together in a continuous way to generate a really solid backlog than totally sit on the Scrum principle of the single product owner, right? I need a backlog. I only need a product owner to the extent that it gives me a backlog, okay? As you start to think about scaling these concepts, again, deeper for a different talk, but as you start to think about teams, backlogs, working tested software, the analog as you scale up is structure, governance, and metrics. So what is my team structure? What is my collaborative teaming strategy across the organization? How do I coordinate value across the organization? And how do I measure progress across the organization? Okay? But teams, backlogs, working tested software is the key. So we came up with this little model we call the 4 quadrants. Basically talks about predictability versus adaptability, emergence, figuring it out as we go versus being really constrained. And we kind of came up with this thing of predictive emergent, predictive convergent, adaptive convergent, and adaptive emergent. Upper left quadrant is ad hoc. Lower left quadrant tends to be where like more plan-driven methodologies live. Agile can definitely live in that quadrant. Lower right is where Agile's home base is, Scrum, XP, some SAFe, large-scale Scrum. Upper right is where Lean Startup lives. And so one of the things that we found is that organizations all have different starting places and they have different destinations, okay? And so understanding where you are and understanding what it's going to take to get there is the key. And so transformation is often a journey through these quadrants. It starts often in the upper left quadrant. I'm striving for predictability, but I'm dealing with emerging requirements all the time. Often I have to figure out how to stabilize the system, increase agility, then increase optionality. And so tying those two concepts together is that I believe that an Agile transformation is basically about forming teams, building backlogs, producing working tested software, at scale developing a structural pattern organizationally that encourages agility, creating a governance model that encourages agility, and creating a metrics model that encourages agility. And basically, and this is kind of the key, make sure I'm on the right thing. Yeah, okay, cool. So anything that gets in the way of doing that is an impediment to agility. Okay? So let's tie a couple of ideas together. Have to form teams, have to build backlogs, have to produce working tested software. At scale, I have to have a structure, I have to have a governance model, and I have to have metrics that encourage agility. We know, based on the previous slide, that the size of the organization, the resistance, the amount of dependencies, the way things, the technology stack, all of that stuff gets in the way. Okay? So transformation is about helping the organization where it is today and then creating a plan to systematically improve the ecosystem so you can get the team's backlogs working tested software and ultimately get to the destination that you want. Okay? It's money, right? It's not teaching people Agile practices. It's not teaching them culture. It's about fundamentally breaking dependencies and removing impediments. Okay? And one of the challenges that we see quite often is that executives, I was dealing with this yesterday with a prospective client, the executives are all on board with Agile. They want business agility. They're willing to fund practices training, right? The problem is that all of the stuff that's going to get in their way, they don't see yet, right? So if I sell them training and then they hit all these impediments, they go, well, Agile doesn't work in my environment, right? Agile doesn't work here. But we know at the beginning that Agile's not going to work there, right? Agile will work there if you can remove the impediments to do Agile, right? So is transformation about teaching them the practices, or is it about creating the conditions where those practices can be effectively applied? It's the difference between teaching me how to run versus becoming a runner, right? Teaching me how to eat right versus being lean and fit, right? The mechanics of running versus like being able to actually run 26.2 miles. It's the difference, right? I have to become the kind of organization that can do Agile stuff. And becoming the kind of organization that can do Agile stuff is the transformation journey. And here is why we talk about the system of delivery is different than the system of transformation. Because the system of delivery is going to change as you improve the system. Earlier on in the presence of dependencies, we're going to have compensating controls to manage those dependencies. We don't want those compensating controls long term, but the system of delivery is going to have to deal with dependencies while they exist. As I break dependencies over time, I can start to deprecate some of the compensating controls. So the system of delivery emerges as the organization improves. The system of transformation is what controls and plans the sequencing of that work. Okay? And here's an interesting thing. Inevitably, I have somebody come up and go, so Mike, are you saying that we should do a plan-driven waterfall agile transformation? And I go, here's the thing, right? We know it's going to change as we go, but we're not walking in totally blind. We know a lot of the stuff that's going to get in our way. And so we can either say, here's a big giant toolkit, go figure it out, or we can say, here's the fundamental patterns, here's where we're going, this is how we need to get there. Okay, cool. Okay, so we talked a little bit about mapping the journey. We've kind of coined this thing called base camps, where we basically set up a series of intermediate steps that you walk through, starting with get the system predictable, reduce batch size, start to break dependencies, start to do team level investing, start to do more innovative stuff up in Base Camp 5. So using the quadrants, you can start to say, what are the intermediate steps necessary to move an organization from one state to another? Question I always get asked is, can you go from this quadrant to that quadrant? Yes. Can you go from that quadrant to that quadrant? Yes. Do you have to go through this? No, right? For the purposes of the slide, right? Okay? But it can be planned out. And the other thing that's interesting is that each of those steps has its own independent economic value prop, right? It's worth investing in. It ties back to the organization's goals. It becomes a leading indicator of organizational progress. So reference architecture, just real quick, right? You guys are all generally familiar with this stuff. There tends to be a team level execution layer, right? And this is going to look a lot like SAFe. It's going to look a lot like large scale Scrum. There tends to be a team level execution layer. There tends to be something above that execution layer that absorbs some of the coordination costs. Requirements decomposition, integration work, release planning, talked about the dual track Scrum stuff. If you think of dual track Scrum, that's the layer that's like evaluating the market, feeding the lower layer with backlog. There tends to be a top level tier that's making investment decisions. Sometimes there's a fourth tier that has to do with like strategy alignment, things like that. At the different levels of the organization, you can tend to model the flow of value across those different parts of the organization using a Kanban-based governance system, kind of a lean value stream oriented governance model. All right, small batch size, limit work in process, focus on getting work finished rather than getting work started, right? All of those principles that enable agility, you can do that at the program and portfolio level. There's metrics that you can start to measure at each of these things. Down at the lowest level tends to be team level Scrum type metrics. In the middle tiers, cycle time, features blocked, rework, tack time, ROI, capitalization at the top, right? So the reference architecture, the patterns of building organizations and layers, absolutely solid. Scrum level or Kanban level at the execution layer with some sort of lean governance model on top. Team level execution metrics at the bottom, more organizationally focused lean metrics at the top. Those are the underlying patterns that you see in all the methodologies, right? If you remember, anchor on the team's backlogs, working tested software, the breaking dependencies, the journey stuff, right? Sometimes those upper layers become more compensating controls until I can get the dependencies broken down at the team level and getting those teams operating more independently. Okay? So we understand based upon the patterns how to make methodological choices about how to implement Agile at scale. Okay? The patterns hold. The patterns, I believe, are universal. How you choose to implement those patterns is a design decision based upon the unique attributes of your company or your particular organization. Change model. Really briefly, right? One of the things that's interesting, okay, and I'm not going to try to walk through this visual, I think I'm just going to talk through it a little bit. Organizations can be broken up into what we call expeditions. You might call them like value streams, depending upon the organization. Sometimes they're product groups, product areas, different areas within the enterprise. But basically, when you're implementing change within an enterprise, what you want to be able to do is to say, this is the group that is going through the change together. Here's the teams, here's the metrics, here's the governance, and we are going to get that group to a definable state. So we talk about the idea of expedition to base camp. Now, what's interesting, there's a slide sequence that I pulled out of here where we talk about using Scrum to manage Scrum, a Scrum implementation. Has anybody ever heard like that idea? What tends to happen in practice is that you get a group of people that are managing the transformation, and their backlog is like, well, I've got these Scrum Masters in place, I've got these people trained, I've got, we've done these things. What my hypothesis is that the unit of value in an Agile transformation is an actual transformed organization. So the increment of the transformation for us is the expedition or the value stream. Okay? So the increment is the expedition. A vertical slice, structure, governance, and metrics, teams, backlogs, working tests of software. The iteration is moving it to base camp 1, getting predictable. Base camp 2, reducing batch size. Base camp 3, breaking dependencies. Base camp 4, start to do team level investment strategies, deprecate some of the governance. Base camp 5, give those teams autonomy to make decisions in market based upon the needs of their customers. Okay? So if you guys think about like Jeff Patton's Mona Lisa picture, right? Where he builds the Mona Lisa in quadrants versus taking it from a sketch to an oil painting, right? That's what we're thinking about here. The unit of value of an Agile transformation is a slice of the organization getting to a better level of performance. The first level of performance might not be the final level of performance, but it might be the best thing that we can possibly do given the constraints that we have in the enterprise. So we take this group and we move it to unpredictable. Then we move it to reduce batch size. Then we start doing the work to break dependencies. Then we start doing team level investment strategies, right? That kind of a thing, right? That's where we're going. Right? So we have this idea of expeditions and base camps kind of moving in parallel with each other. This is the slide sequence I was looking for. Right? Different expeditions can be at different base camps at different points of their journey. Okay? And get a lot of times people say, well, how do I get a waterfall team and an Agile team to work together? Well, the reality is that often the Agile team can't be as agile as it wants to be. And the waterfall team can't be as waterfall as it wants to be. So we have to get the waterfall team to just a basic level of agility, iterative and incremental delivery. And then we've got to marry the processes of the Agile team to be able to line up with that other team. So it's like getting a base camp 4 team to work with a base camp 1 team, kind of a thing. Okay? Point that I want you to take from this is that there is an underlying pattern that I believe is universal. Organizations can be broken up into vertical slices, and they can be brought through a journey as you begin to start to introduce these ideas into the organization. Each step in the journey can be measurable and economically justified. It can actually be planned out. Okay? One of the things that we're starting to have some success with, which is really fascinating, and again, I'm probably just going to make some hair on the back of some people's necks kind of like ruffle up, but it's like what we found is that organization to organization to organization, there's actually intermediate outcomes that we can define that are pretty universal across organizations. If you want to get a team predictable, there's kind of a pattern for how to do that. You want to start reducing batch size? There's a series of standard steps that you can do to get a team into a reduced batch size state. Now, is it slightly different in how you do it for every organization? Of course, right? Are the challenges different in every organization? Absolutely. But the steps are fundamentally the same, right? How you hit those steps is what tends to be different. Okay, I've got 6 minutes. It's brutal. Okay, so let's do this. I want to hit the skills and experiences piece at the end, so I'm going to hit this really quick. So basically with results management, one of the things that I believe is incredibly important, because again, right, for us as a consultancy, it's the difference between whether we stay or go, is can you actually measure progress, right? Can you demonstrate that what you're doing adds value? So we talk about transformation metrics, right? So are we improving the capabilities of the organization? Are we doing the things that we said we would do, achieving the outcomes that we said we would achieve, moving the organization to the base camp in the time that we said we would? Super important. My CFO created some of these slides for me. Can we measure predictability, quality, early return on investment, lower costs, innovation, and product fit? You know, financial measurements. Right? Are we able to actually demonstrate increased return on investment or capitalization rate or revenue acceleration or productivity enhancements? Can we measure it? Right? We hypothetically, right, we notionally get the idea that Agile should give these things to us, but can we prove it? Right? I would suggest, I've actually walked into some of my teams sometimes that weren't doing this early enough in an engagement, and I'll just tell them, I say, look, you're like a dead man walking, right? If you can't measure the improvements in a tangible way, you are one CFO looking at the spend on that and going, do we really need this? They can't prove anything, right? So being able to prove it, being able to economically justify it is the key to being able to keep doing it. It is. Right? Can you measure progress on the transformation, and can you economically justify it? Can you tie it back to what it is that you're trying to do as an organization? So roles and responsibilities, right? So I'm an Agilist through and through, right? I've been doing this pretty heavy for almost 15 years now. And when I decided I wanted to build my own company, you know, I had this really awesome idea that like it would be totally flat, everybody could do everything, everybody would be equal, everybody would be peers, everybody would have no boss, right? How do you think that worked out for me? Right? Super, super difficult, right? And it's going to get a little bit into the next section. But the thing that you fundamentally realize, like, so as we started defining different roles in our engagements, what it really came down to for us is that there are people that are really influential, and there are people that are really good at getting work done. And one of the things that you find is that the skills of influence, like who you are as a person, is really different than just being a really smart Agilist. Understanding how to get somebody to flip their point of view, having deep empathy, being able to establish point of view alignment, being able to create safety, right? Those things are really, really difficult. A lot of times as Agile practitioners or Agile coaches, we come in pretty hot and heavy with the idea of, this is how you do Agile, right? This is what Ken Schwaber said, this is what Dean Leffingwell said, this is what the book said, this is how you do it, right? And we might even be awesome at doing it, right? But as an Agilist, can you have executive level conversations that tie all of these different things you want to do to the real needs and business drivers of the executive? Just really in practice, you know, when we walk into an executive, and I feel like up to about maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I feel like I owe an apology to every executive I ever met, right? Because they'd be like, hey, Mike, you know, this Agile stuff, it's interesting, right? You know, tell me a little about it. I'm like, oh yeah, Scrum, user stories, blah, 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 sprint planning, right? Power of the team. Maybe it's a little longer than that, maybe like 8 or 9 years, right? But like there was a point in time in my career where I was really excited about the methodology. But understanding how those things become levers for our executives and deeply caring about what the executive problem is and being able to get them to flip, establishing that empathy, aligning point of views, creating safety is a different skill set than can I do the work? Right? Because it's not immediately obvious to everybody that doing the work is going to produce the results that we want to for the executives. Okay? And so my journey in building this company is, and again, it's kicking and screaming, that recognizing that different people have different roles, and what you don't want to do is go hire a really excited Agile coach and put them in front of your CIO and have them talk about Scrum. Right? They don't care. right? You have to be able to tie it up to the economics, right? You have to be able to align with what it is that they want to do, okay? And then last but not least, the thing that I'm super geeked about right now, because it's like the life that we are living, is understanding how to start to source through talent. And it's an interesting thing, right? And again, you think about it from, why would Mike include something about talent in an Agile transformation talk? Well, at the end of the day, it's the people that you guys have in your organization that are going to lead this change, okay? And understanding the attributes associated with different success and failure patterns is really interesting. The reason why I grouped this slide into the 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0 is because it reflects our journey of understanding. When we very first started, we hired people based upon how smart they were as Agilists, what they had told us they had done on their resume, how active were they in the community, right? Were they blogging and speaking and doing things? And were they a good culture fit for us? Right? And our hypothesis is that if they had all those things, they would be a great leading Agile person. And our hit rate was about 50%. Okay? And you'd kind of go, well, why? Right? What broke? And one of the things we started thinking about was, well, people have different core beliefs. They have different home bases. And we started thinking about, like, are you people focused or are you business focused? Are you small team focused or are you enterprise focused? There's a lot of people that I think their home base is, I really believe it's the people and the interactions that make all this stuff work. And that's true to a point, right? And they're really focused on getting teams awesome. And that's great, right? But the challenge is that if you're in a context that's very enterprise and business focused, you can't lead with that language. We know it's there, right? We know it's important, but we have to lead with enterprise business focused language. And a lot of large organizations, that's where they are. And so what we started to try to get up underneath was, what was the person's home base in terms of what they truly believed? Because our hypothesis is that sitting in an interview, people could say, they could play the game. But under pressure of an executive, right, having to problem solve in real time, they'd go to their home base. The behavior stuff, we have about 4 years worth of data at this point around different behavioral models. And we use a tool called People DNA from a company called People Best that's in Southern California. And we've started gathering data on people we interview and hire, people we interview and fire, people that work great, people that are kind of on the bubble, people that are rock stars. And we've developed patterns, data patterns. And what's really fascinating is that you can start to model the people that are going to be able to sit in front of an executive in a very high influence capacity versus people that are going to show up and do the work. What's really fascinating is if you look at my consulting team versus my ops team, like the difference between consultants and like accountants, really, really different profiles, right? So you need one profile if you need somebody to muscle through and get work done. You need a different profile if it's really high influence. And some of those things can be educated and coached, and some of them can't. Some of them are who you are, right? Just an interesting observation. That, we found, still wasn't enough. So we started looking at emotional intelligence. We started looking at intellectual intelligence. We're starting to explore things like, how good are you at pattern recognition? How good are you at systems thinking? There's a tool that I happened upon a couple months ago that I think might be the one missing ingredient, and this is super fascinating, is it measures you. It's kind of like DISC, but it measures you on whether you're controlling, non-controlling, logical, or emotional. Okay? And so, interesting fun fact is I am like 75% logically controlling, right? So you want a good reason for something? I got it, right? My wife, on the other hand, is the exact opposite. We're actually non-complementary opposites is what it calls us, right? It's kind of nice, right? Been married 25 years, so it can't be that bad, right? She's emotionally controlling. So when she feels a certain way, she sits on it, right? And then there's patterns of non-emotional or emotional non-controlling and logical non-controlling. What was kind of fascinating, and this is kind of a missing piece, is we have people that would profile really great, but they would show up into our engagements and they would be like logically non-controlling or emotionally non-controlling. And when you're in a situation where you have to get somebody to do something differently, right? You have to be in a high influence role, right? Having some aspect of your personality that's kind of controlling is actually kind of necessary to move change, right? And so like cracking this code on people is super fascinating, okay? So just to kind of, so this is not super relevant. So just to kind of put a bow on this and hopefully set you guys up for your day, what I want you guys to think about is when you're learning something that is like a technique or a practice, or it's like a really cool idea, right? That's awesome, right? And we want a gigantic library of those things, right? They form the basis of the models that we're going to create, and all that stuff is incredibly valuable. The question that I want you guys to ask yourself is, okay, cool, what is the mechanism of change? How do I get there? Okay? And my thought is we have to understand deeply our why. We have to have a clear hypothesis for how we're going to tackle the problem. We have to have a clear hypothesis for what we're actually going to do when we show up at the beginning of the day. And we have to have a really clear hypothesis on who's going to do that work and how are we going to divide responsibilities. And fundamentally, are they really capable of doing it? And so for us, all of that other stuff about how you get there is starting to be this thing we call a system of transformation. And it's been very, very powerful because our customers, our organizations, believe it or not, they want us to have a plan. Okay? They want us to have a hypothesis, not just spend a bunch of money on training and hope for the best, but like, how are we going to get from point A to B, and how do we know we're making progress? So think about your day through that lens, and think about like how you're going to bring this stuff back and how you're going to implement it. And I think you'll have like a greater shot of like making this day useful for you. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it.